focus this time around is our president, President Tinubu, who has called for universal sanctions by UN nation against companies and individuals involved with illegal smuggling of arms and minerals into and out of Africa. You know, the president left Nigeria on Monday with his 17-man delegation to New York. And interestingly, the man is representing Africa very well, being the chairman of ECOWAS, and in that capacity, he was in position to have an address, and he talked about the need for UN to place sanctions on companies and individuals who are involved in illegal smuggling of arms in and out of Africa. Idauza, what's your take on this?
Oh, I think by now, the whole social media space should have been awash with hashtag Justice for Africa.
That's
you see, for me, the address at the United Nations General Assembly by their president, I would title that Demand for Justice and Equity for Africa. And I am so glad that he was just speaking for Nigeria alone, but he spoke for Africa in line with the theme for the conference, which is rebuilding trust and reigniting solidarity among nations. And of course, be rest assured that today the level of distrust globally is on the roof level. And so there's a need for the world to talk about, you know, reigniting solidarity among nations, building trust between nations. But it should not be hypocritical. And I think these are the very clear issues that the president has spoken to. For me, is looking at it holistically. And the president says, if this team must mean anything or deserve the honor of us gathering here, it must be about the global community coming together in the order of the Marshall Plan, especially for the pillaged Africans. And we have said this over and over again. You know, when you read Hoskin's work, you know, The Economic Hitman, it speaks to how global powers have been using multinational corporations, disguising to further their political interests in some of all these African countries. And so it was quite necessary for the president to call out the nations and their multinational companies who are here pillaging our nation. And with no commensurate compensation for us. Yesterday we were talking about corporate social responsibility. That if you're taking something away that is creating a whole lot of havoc for another system, then of course you must find a way to ameliorate the suffering of those people. So much wealth is taken away from Africa to build Europe. And you can hear in that speech the president said, Africa is not a problem to be avoided. Neither is it a continent to be pitied. The real truth is that Africa is the key to the wealth of nations. And therefore they must be treated with some measure of dignity. So this was quite very, very reassuring for me as a person that we're looking at it and say, look, it's not about Nigeria is open for business, for example, but the question is not whether Nigeria is open for business. The question is actually, is the world open for our business? And that question needs to be answered. If, of course, the United Nations and the developed Western countries really mean well for Africa, they should be able to answer that question. You know, the last time we were talking about neocolonialism and how it's affected us. That you see, at certain point in time, there's a way that these superpower nations seems to put a gag on your even intellect base getting into Europe. They don't allow agricultural products to get where we have competitive advantage. We don't have technical things to sell to them. So the things that we should be selling to them, of course, by the way, you see, you take yam to England, for example, they tell you, oh, it's carcinogenic, you can't sell it. But we are eating the yam here, we have not died. So how do we determine it? So this is the fundamental issue here that, of course, the president is speaking to. Now, it's also to look at it from the point of view. If we are also saying in Africa here, you build Europe after the World War. Again, the president helped the United Nations to trace its own origin and its birth, which is the post-Second World War Europe, devastated by that war. And how, of course, you remember what popularly called the Marshall Plan, which was an address delivered by the American Secretary of State, George Marshall, in June 5, 1947, in Harvard University, talking about how to rebuild Europe. And he itemized a whole lot of things that should be done for Europe to be able to grow out of the rubbles of the Second World War. Now, this included financial aid to Europe, grants, loans to Europe. It included technical transfer of knowledge to Europe. This was also, there was a level of support to enable inter-European cooperation, which of course was called the Organization of European Economic Countries, OEC, now transformed to EU. And this was to foster trade between the European countries among themselves. But as we speak, Africa can't trade with themselves. And we are tied to the apron string of our SY colonial master. And this is why the president said in his address very clearly, we don't want to be any appendage to anybody, neither do we want to patronize anybody. All we are asking for is just fairness, is just justice, so that Africa will be allowed to breathe, to use that popular word.
All right, in allowing Africa to breathe, it takes two. I think, yes, it's good the president is asking for fairness and equity in the international space for trade. We've been able to trade what we want to trade. But on the side where he called for universal sanctions by the UN against companies and individuals involved in illegal smuggling of arms and minerals into and out of Africa, I think if we're calling for the companies and individuals, calling the UN to sanction them, we should have first of all called our own government to sanction those in Africa who are complicit in the crime. Because it takes two to tangle. The Europeans or the West cannot be doing what they are doing to Africa without the cooperation of Africans. So I think that's the first place to start. I believe in cleaning your house first, getting things right with your house, before you go out to call your neighbor and tell your neighbor, this is the pot or this is the dirt you are bringing into my house. Or if you want to do it both ways, if you want to do the same, do it simultaneously. While you're calling out to your neighbor and say, don't bring dirt into my house, you should also make sure that you're telling those in your house, do not encourage them to bring dirt into the house. So I think... You see,
Blessing, it's not as simple as you tend to look at it. Now, when you understand the way global politics work, you see, when you create a confusion in an environment, what you're doing is that you're deliberately creating a confusion to allow some things to suddenly happen. And this is why when you see mass protests, for example, and then people are on the streets, what do you see? While police is trying to stop people from protesting, you see hoodlum breaking into shops and they are looting. You can't control that, because the person has deliberately set confusion in place. And this is what most powers in Europe is doing. You see, all the light ammunitions that we see here, which is our nightmare, which is putting pressure on our policemen, where is it coming from? Let's assume our borders are porous. Which country is it living? Are their borders not closed? Now, this is the issue. You see, people are taking advantage of our vulnerability. So they have kept us to be perpetually poor. And I think this is what Mr. President is speaking to. So you become so poor that you become vulnerable to crime activities. So what the European powers have done is to create this kind of confusion. I would need you to go read Perkins' work on the Confessions of the Economic Hitman, and you know the kind of mass politics that was done by the United States using their multinational in the Suez Canal crisis. And so this is the issue. So it makes difficult for home country really to be able to galvanize. Imagine, for example, and this is a question people are still asking. You go to Borno, for example, where your military cannot enter, and you are seeing that a ragtag army called Boko Haram in quote seems to be more sophisticated than the Nigerian trained army. Now, who is providing these people with the finance? Who is providing them with the equipment that is more sophisticated than what our evil nation can buy? Look at the politics of buying Tucano jet from America, for example, to fight the insurgents in this country. Even the one that Brazil was to sell to Nigeria, that they have bought second-hand, America forbids Nigeria from having it to fight its internal crisis. And I think this is issues that the president is speaking to. The complicity of the so-called world powers and multinational corporations who are operating, even including NGOs,
yes,
who are operating in our territory, fomenting trouble and making it very difficult for the government of Africa to really pursue policies, internal policies that will bring about development.
Be that as it may, we cannot rule out the participation of Africans. Take, for instance, Nigeria. During elections, we all know the way arms are being smuggled into different parts of the country. If there is no market for a thing, if there are no buyers for a thing, you will not have sellers for that particular thing.
Yeah, but it's not government that is patronizing. This is the point I am making.
It is not
now,
government.
these things are coming illegally.
Both ends. Yes.
No. They are coming illegally into our country. Yeah. The government doesn't import these arms.
Yes.
Now, these arms are not sold officially to governments.
They are sold
but they are sold illegally to create a destabilization within your system. This is the real issue. So it's not about, you see, even the election you spoke about, you should understand the foreign interest in who winning our elections.
Yes.
Take, for example, you look at the kind of report, for example, that the EU wrote on the Nigeria 2023 elections, even where they were not present at polling stations. Now, all these issues is to determine the outcome of who become your leader. And they are ensuring that the person who become your leader is somebody that who is weak enough to be manipulated. Now, these are designs by the international powers. And that's why the president is saying, if you're saying that we need to build trust, if you're saying we need to reignite solidarity so that nations can have, equal opportunity. We're not asking you to give us an advantage. So that we can have equal opportunity to grow, then of course we must start from where it starts. Then, of course, look at the activities of your companies and what your government is doing in our area. You cannot be mining, for example, when you see sites of mining, land that are destroyed. We spoke to this last time. Uranium is taken from Niger Republic, powering the whole of France, whereas Niger Republic has no electricity. Now, the instability that is happening in that place is sponsored from outside. So it's like you, in my village, they said if a fowl has a strong man standing behind it, it will use its beak to kill a cow. This is the kind of situation you are seeing in Africa. And this is what the president is speaking to at Onga.
Listen, I like the fact that the president is taking advantage of a forum like this.
Yes.
It's like speaking to the world. You're speaking at the United Nations General Assembly. It's like you're speaking to the whole world. However, the president is aware of his responsibility or the challenges at home. But if he's at a forum like this, there's a need to address the whole world, individuals, companies, NGOs, because you must understand that these arms are not manufactured in Nigeria.
Of course.
And so it takes two to tango, like you said, collaboration.
Yes.
It's an international collaboration. And that's why the president is taking advantage of this forum to address the whole world.
I agreed. I'm not disputing any of all that has been said, but what I'm saying that we should balance it. As much as he's using such a forum to speak to the international community, then he should come back home, or African leaders should come back home and
But you see, the problem is that you have not listened to the address. If you have listened to the president's address, you won't be speaking like this. He said, few days into taking office as the president of Nigeria, he has taken some very critical steps, and that was including taking away this very corrupt subsidy regime. They have also taken away this currency manipulation that has created a whole lot of economic destabilization, and there are a whole lot of critical reforms that the government of Nigeria is embarking on. But no, this is the issue that you need.
One country in Africa, because
wait, blessing. See, you are not following the trend. Now he's saying this is what we are doing. We are trying to do a reform in our country. Now this reform to succeed, you also have to balance, because there are a lot of things that government cannot do. We are talking about the position of some non-state actors,
yes,
who are also very dominant, and they are having more power than, of course, the state actor right here in Nigeria as we speak. I've given you a sample, for example, about the Lekki issue, where, of course, you find that the non-state actors are saying, look, you can't collect toll here, and government really is becoming helpless. Because what you do is that if government decide to say they want to wedge the hammer, what that will mean is that you are killing your citizen, and that brand you very terribly in the international community. So government are conscious, and there are a whole lot of things that are sponsored internally to ensure that those reforms don't work. Now, this sponsorship is what you must understand. They don't come from within. Yes. Somebody is certainly fueling it from the outside. Take, for example, NLC is talking about strike. And they tell you, oh, we want to go on strike. Why do they want to go on strike? They want to go on strike. They said, oh, the economic hardship is biting on all of us. We have all agreed, even including NLC, that we cannot continue with the subsidy regime, that it was not sustainable. Now, why are they on regime where we say, okay, let subsidy go? You want government to continue to borrow. You are speaking on the one breath that subsidy is a scam. You are speaking on another breath that the government is over borrowing. Now you are coming without government having revenue, and you are asking government to spend more. Where will the money come from? Now, all these destabilization issues are things that are fueled from the outside, not really within, to destabilize the regime, that you cannot really settle down to do your thing. What the president is asking for is create an ecosystem for us to prosper. Now, once the West are not funding and they are not coming from the back door to create this destabilization in Africa, Africa can do well, and prosperity can actually come to everybody. I think that's what the president is speaking to.
That's great.
Yeah. And we hope that every action will be taken to ensure that Africa grows on the international side and on the local side.
Yeah, that's great. There are two sides to a coin. You're talking about the international side, and you're emphasizing on the work to be done at home. So these two has to come together for us to have a productive result. Let's move on. The federal government has partnered with a financial institution to launch an initiative to impact 2 million youths, youth empowerment this time around, and 1 million SMEs in Nigeria. Yesterday we talked about the need to empower young people, not just for them to be taking on white-collar jobs, but this is a good initiative where the federal government is partnering with a financial institution to launch, a scheme whereby it's going to impact 2 million young Nigerians. That was but
it's part of the things that we are speaking to at the moment. What are we doing at home? Government is trying to do so much to get a lot of people off the streets at the present. A whole lot of effort is going on to see that the system is robust, accommodate everybody, prosperity is shared. And these are the kind of initiative that we all talk about from day to day. And I think one angle that must also be added today is really because I think we need a lot of financial education in Nigeria, especially in terms of running business. That's fundamental. Because while these results are passed out, we do hope that the recipient will be able to be skilled enough to manage these resources. You see, it's just one thing to give you money to go and do business. It's another thing for you to run that business profitably, which is actually the real crisis we face. Now, for the SMEs, you also see the problem where our value system is also impinging the prosperity of businesses around us. A whole lot of people who work are so without value that they steal the resource of little company that they are not able to survive. Now, all these things require us to all work together to see how some of this initiative of government really will see the light of the day. That if you're advancing some money to people, let's also be hopeful that the people who are the beneficiary would have done a lot in terms of writing a very good business plan with a cash flow that is realistic to see that the business really make profit, and then of course continue to expand.
Listen, I like the fact that this scheme is trying to target 1 million SMEs.
Yes.
What do you think will be the impact of that? You know, the economy should be driven by SMEs.
Of course.
As done in China and all these global players. So if that is happening in Nigeria, what could be the impact?
It means that there will be more economic activities, there will be more jobs, because now that the SMEs are getting support, it's for some of them that maybe perhaps were struggling. More strength has been received, so they can take on maybe more staff, and they can spread now, and they'll produce more. So you have more economic activities, you have money exchange in hands, because those who are going to be in the employ of some of these SMEs now have some power to make purchases of things that they need. So that means that the economy would grow, and we'll definitely see an increase in our GDP at the end of the year, or at the end of a certain period. It may not be the end of the year, because this is just coming at the last quarter of the year. So let's see over the next 1 year, it's bound to reflect in our GDP, and it's bound to reflect in the economic boom that we'll see.
Lesson emphasized on the economic boom,
Yes.
which we are praying it
Oh
happens.
yes,
So-
oh yes, oh yes.
All right, I guess I feel like we should be having this analysis. We should go on and on, but time is not on our side. Okay, we can still take one more story. All right, let's move on. The group executive director of Dangote revealed that the refinery is going to be on course. You know, Nigerians have been waiting for this respite.
Oh my God.
We've had about 4 to 5 refineries. They are moribund, you know. They're not working up to expectation. And Dangote refinery is coming up officially. It's going to commence operation in October. You know, diesel production, and that of petrol will be in November. Idauza. This is another good news coming out of Nigeria.
Yeah, well, I'm just waiting to see this thing roll out, because we had expected that before now that this refinery was going to be in operation. I think Nigeria really waited for it. And that was why, of course, all the promises of subsidy removal was actually hinged on this. That we're looking at, if Dangote refinery is producing, and we can take away, for example, the logistic costs from petrol, at least you will save up to 17 naira. So if you take 17 naira away from the current price, that's some gain, which will be like a succor to the average man on the streets.
Yeah.
October is here. November is here. We just do hope that the goalpost is not shifted again, because the day the president came to commission that refinery, we thought the following day that the petrol will be out. But unfortunately, we still have to wait till October and November. It's a good news. We are hopeful. We don't want to give up hope. We will do pray that by October, November, we can see this diesel roll out and the price of diesel come down, because that will significantly impact production activity in Nigeria. It will reduce the cost of product, even our inflation. It can drag it down, because it will have a significant impact on our macroeconomic stability. Because what you're seeing is that now you're not looking for dollars to import petrol or diesel. You can actually source them locally. So Nigeria can now be a naira economy as against the dollarized economy that we are driving now. So this will go a long way in addressing basic issue for us, because petroleum and its associate importation take the bigger chunk of the foreign exchange that we always scramble for in Nigeria. So once that is taken off the road, I think it would be a really good news for the common man on the street.
Yes, I like the fact that they're starting with the refining of diesel and jet fuel, because those are the two most expensive of all the petroleum products that we have in the country and very key. So once that happens, like Idausa has said, of course it will impact on production, because a lot of companies support their energy generation with diesel. So when that happens, it will be a sigh of relief for those companies, even if it's just 50 naira that it's reduced from the price of diesel. It is something where you multiply by the liters that you need to buy. And then for jet fuel, let's see how that over time will maybe reduce the cost of airfares. And we're also hoping for petrol as well, premium motor spirit, that the price also comes down November. But I know that significantly the effect of this, the Dangote refinery, will be felt over quite a time, maybe like a year. We'll look at it at this time next year. But it's good it is happening at the festive season, where people move about more. You have more movement of people and goods at this season. So we just hope that it actually comes to pass.
I can't wait for this respite, because the refinery is meant to produce about over 600,000 barrels per day, and that's huge. That's big for Nigeria market.
The biggest single line refinery in the world.
In the world, and that's big. Well, let me come from this angle. What are the lessons inherent for Nigeria government if an individual could come up with this kind of solution? You know, we've had about 4 refineries in Port Harcourt, you know, but over the years, they've not been working up to capacity expected. What are the lessons inherent for Nigeria if an individual could come up with this initiative? People will say, okay, government doesn't have business in business and all that. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it also speaks to the fact that it is easier for individuals to run businesses than it is for government to run, especially the kind of government we've had since independence, the government of patronage. I remember Richard Joseph wrote one book. He called it Prebenda Politics in Nigeria, the rise and fall of the Second Republic. And of course, in that book, it was a masterpiece on how the politics of prebendalism festered in Nigeria that led to the military coup of January 1, 1984. And what it was speaking to is the fact that, you see, the public service in Nigeria is so corrupt that it's driven ethnic, what they call, I use the word patronage really, because what we're trying to do is that you just get people into work, whether they are qualified or not qualified. So rather than really elevating meritocracy, it has actually promoted mediocrity. And so when you have mediocres running your business, you cannot be sure to make profit. And this is the real critical issue. And this also came even from the abuse of the federal character principle, which was supposed to equalize access to critical national resource, but it's abused. Take, for example, you're seeking people to go into Federal Government Unity College, for example, and you're doing recruitment for students who should be first-class brain. And then you are getting people who are not even able to pass common entrance into the system. You produce them. You just send quota to give them employment. You can see why it is difficult for us to really manage national assets. So for me, it's also a proven fact here that it is better that government regulates than get themselves neck deep into business operation. Because if we are allowing private sector to thrive, myself and yourself will become business owner. All the government needs to do is to regulate us and create the ecosystem for us to prosper. Once this is done, then we have prosperity. Really, government has no business in business.
Well, I think it will work when private sector leads on a lot of things, because private sector, the private sector, they are goal-oriented. You know, a lot of things that government would tolerate, inefficiency and people not performing, in the private sector, it will not be tolerated, because there's a goal why the business was set up in the first place. Yes, to make profit, but there is also the goal of expansion. There are targets to be met. And so there are strategies along that line, which we do not actually see a lot in government. It's only in some administrations you will find that there are clear plans, clear leader plans to reach a particular goal. And so the willpower to ensure that that goal is achieved is what is lacking mostly in government. And that's why we've seen that the refineries we've had have not been working. That willpower has not been there. The commitment has not been there. Having the key people in place, having square pegs in square holes, we've not actually had that. And also, continuity. Government is not really a continuity in Nigeria. One person may be in power today, or one administration may have an agenda. The moment that administration ends, who continues from where that administration starts? So we have not built institutions that support government, that build on legacies. That has been the problem. And not to mention corruption, which is also being...
You see, Blessing, a lot of people have been talking about these institution things. Institutions don't run themselves. People run institutions. No matter how strong your institutions are, if they have people without values in them, like they say, the chain is as strong as its weakest link. We've had all this argument, oh, when we build the institution, give power to institution. People run institutions. I was talking to my wife yesterday, she was talking to me, how she was going to beg somebody who had been employed to work, to come to work and say, please, just do the work now. And I said, why are you begging? He said, because he said he's not going to work. I said, if he's not going to work, query the person. He said, if we query, they will sack me. Because there's somebody is going to call up
or a tough situation
who is bigger than me and say, look, you are treading on a landmine. So this is a problem with our system. It's really not because we don't have this. There are institutions. All we don't have is that we don't have the requisite people with good values. There is no crime you will do in Nigeria that you will not have somebody to call. This is the issue. So if you are the head of an agency and then they call you, your boss call you and say step down, what do? You step up. So this is a problem. So it's really not about institutions. It's about people with values. That when we begin to emphasize value, morality, ethics over cronyism and ethnic patronage, probably we can get to where we want to get to. But as we speak, this is real issues. In short, one of my friends told me, say in public service, you will see where cleaners are more powerful than directors.
But how did the private sector get that right? Because it is still from the same pool that the private sector sourced these people.
Yes, because when the MD say don't come to work now, if they call him now, he has a decision to make. There's no cover that will call him. He's the owner of his money. So that's why it's different. See, it's not that you don't have some people without value, but you see that in the system, the way we are wired, especially as Africans, there's always one senior brother who is somewhere, and then you must have to obey your senior brother when he says you should do something, no matter how serious that crime is. But for a private person who wants to make profit, of course, he will not tolerate that. So this is where the real issues lie. And I think it was PPAK who wrote his one work, a very seminal thesis. He called it the two publics. Why African has not been able to evolve. That at the primordial level, there are some certain things that cannot happen. You know, when you go to your village now, you want to do burial, for example, there are things corners you cannot cut. Reason is because At that level, the institutions are so strong and the people preserve their values. But when you come to the national level, because we don't, at the civic level, you don't have that kind of commitment. Because it's still Iloibo, the work of the white man. And it does not belong to anybody. So you see people are just going there to take their cake.
National cake.
National cake. All right. Let's take a shift from Nigeria. Let me take both of you now to Dubai. And the news coming from Dubai says Road and Transport Authority has reported 90% completion rate of construction work on the cycling tracks in Dubai. That was that you've been in Dubai severally. Give us an account of your experience driving in Dubai and what it's like, because there's a news coming from there that the 90% completion rate of construction on a cycling track or the cycling tracks in that city, which we don't have that kind of privilege here. So now in Dubai, give us the experience driving in Dubai, having this kind of experience.
Well, I think the city has been planned. In short, really, in terms of infrastructure, is already overbuilt. Because the RATIA, the Road Transport Regulatory Authority in Dubai, are doing excellently well in terms of providing access to road. And so they have so much money. And you see, it's very simple. How did they get to this? It came with the SALIC model of road transportation, electronic tagging of tolls. What the Dubai government did was to see the needed infrastructure, and they discovered that getting this infrastructure would be just difficult. And because you need so much money to do that. So what they did was to privatize some certain roads. Free road. The word SALIC means smooth road. So they came up with the concept of SALIC. And so they built some major highways that are electronically tagged. And what that means is that every vehicle that is registered in the UAE has a tag on it. And every car owner has a wallet where you put money. So once you drive past on certain road, there are no physical toll gates, but there is a SALIC toll there, a camera that snaps that your tag and automatically withdraw money from your wallet. And annually, UAE is raking in $1 billion from SALIC alone. There's no human intervention. And so they can build anything they want to build. And this thing we're talking about is not 2 years. In 1 year, you just see something spring up, because the system has been designed in such a way that there is fewer and lesser human intervention. And this is where, of course, we really need to learn. We don't need this physical toll gate anymore. There are technologies to drive this. Let government enter into partnership with individuals, multinational companies that can build road. Green road from here to Abuja, green road from here to Port Harcourt. Government don't need to put one. Let them tie these roads and tag it. If you want to drive on a smooth road, you go there. If you don't want to drive on a smooth road, then you can use the alternatives that are available. So once this happens, and people who invest in these facilities are able to get their money out and then pay royalty to the government, it will be good for all of us. And it will be good for the citizen. So what I tell you, the United Arab Emirates, the road infrastructure is excellent. Whether it's where people live or where people don't live, it's massively excellent. Now, what they are doing is that, of course, people are talking climate change. UAE is hosting COP28. They are going to be at the heart of the world next year to this climate financing. And then they must demonstrate that they are also helping in fighting carbon emission. So the whole idea about cycling is to ensure that people can drive bicycle around city, and of course that will help, of course, traffic on the one hand, but it will also reduce carbon emissions, which will also help fight the issues with climate change.
Now let's start with your assessment of, the natural resources economics in Nigeria, looking at the Nigerian space. Nigeria is blessed with so many natural resources. We're endowed with it. But I would like to have your assessment of the level of demand, the supply, and the distribution of this natural resource, because that's what the economic part of it is all about. We are looking at the natural resources economics, and it's all about the demand, supply, and the distribution of these resources. Give us your own assessment about the distribution, the demand, and the supply of these natural resources in Nigeria.
Well, speaking to the economies of the natural resources in Nigeria, and I think it's one conversation that we will need to sit down to speak to, and I think it's not just Nigeria, and it's indeed Africa. One of the issues that we must recognize is that Africa has been a producer of primary products because God has endowed us with so much of natural resources. And now these resources that we have, other people are helping us convert them to money. And so we really make nothing out of it compared to those who are really making a huge fortune out of it. Take, for example, you look at Ghana cocoa or Cote d'Ivoire, earning a little bit above 2 billion. And whereas when it's converted to chocolate in Europe, they are earning multi-billions in dollars. Who really benefits? Same happened to the crude oil that God had given to us here on our ground. And so, you see that as Africans, we have not been able really to leverage the things that nature had given to us. And this is because of capacity, this because of competence in creating the requisite technology to actually convert these resources to more and further wealth. Mentor Tabe wrote a book he called By the Future, in which he described the true state of the natural resources used in Africa. And he said that Africans tend to have what he called Esau mentality, taking the story from Esau and Jacob in the Holy Book, that Esau was a hunter, and of course Jacob was one who was a farmer, who nurtures, who grew things, but Esau was one who kill and eat. And he says that is a mindset of most African nations, and Nigeria is not different with the use of our natural resources. And don't forget, in the same holy book, the scripture says hunters, they can't even roast the game they catch. You know what it is now. Those days when we were in the village, you see hunter go to the farm, they kill an antelope, sell it to the woman who is running a bar. And then, of course, the woman cut it into pieces in the afternoon. The same body, the less that they said, they use it to come and eat the same thing. Now, this is how African has been operating, with the hunter mindset. So we only sell out what we use, and we don't get real value for it. Because, again, we have not also invested in research and development. We have not invested in the value chain of some of all these products. Imagine that, of course, we are just selling crude. We just draw the crude from the ground and we sell. And that's all we are celebrating. Now, the person who processes the crude gets urea from it, gets so much value. Over 1,000 items come out from the same crude. And they are only selling petrol to us and selling diesel to us and kerosene. But there are other associated products that are coming out from crude, which value go to the man who processes it. And I think this is why we really need to be thinking about what we do with our resources. Again, speaking to multinational companies, who are to do business with us, that Africans should be able to get to that negotiation table where they are not just coming to take our crude and process it in their country. We should be able to reach agreement whereby they take our crude and they process it here so that we can see the full value of what we are getting. And that's why I was so very passionate when speaking to the president issues on the Marshall Plan. Because one of the components of the Marshall Plan for Europe was to see how to grant technical assistance to the war-torn Western European countries, even in the form of knowledge transfer. So what that means is that you need to do some business right there within Europe to stimulate their economic growth. So multinational companies who comes around to take resources from Africa must be willing not just to have us just give them the crude resources which nature has given to us, but that they invest in its refining here. They are coming to take stone here in the name of gold. We are taking uranium from here in the name of gold. They are taking California from Nigeria in the name of gold. And so many precious stones that God has given to us. Now, but these are taken outside, they are processed, and then, of course, they are powering the civilization every other way in the world. But I think this is where Africa needs to really bend down and see how much we can invest in research and development to see how we can transform these natural resources and then not just sell the raw materials, but we're also selling it with value addition.
Okay, in trying to have value addition for the minerals that we have, for the abundant natural resources that we have, what can Africa do? Because we seem to depend on foreign investments. Now, if we are even to have foreign investments, how can we have responsible investments that the minerals and the resources that have been explored are not just taken out as raw materials? There is although there are plans in place to ensure processing and that we get full value for these resources. Can we do it by ourselves? Can we do it jointly? What exactly can we do?
I think there's so much we can do in terms of how we do international business. And this is where we must be very deliberate in negotiating or procuring foreign services. You see, in procurement agreements, there are some certain things that some nations do to tell you that we're going to enter into a service level agreement with you. This is a business we want to do with you. Now, we are expecting that in 5 years, in 10 years, these are the outcome we want for our nation. So we are not just giving them the liberty to just exploit these things and take it for their advantage. We must also be talking about what we benefit. And I think ISO 2600 has spoken to this critically in terms of what they call corporate responsibility and quality, which is a global standard. That if you are taking something from my soil, you have a moral responsibility as a corporate citizen to invest in that entity. And this is a global arrangement that everybody subscribes to. So we as a nation, those who negotiate on behalf of the rest of us, must understand these principles. To say, yes, share has been here since the 1960s. They have been taking resources from us. What value are they adding? We're only just counting the pythons they are giving to us in terms of the sharing of the dollar that is sold in crude. There's no value addition to the environment. And this is very, very important. That if a company is coming and is making so much fortune from our land, they are morally and ethically bound to add value to the society in which they are taking these resources. You can't be taking so much billion from us, and then the neighborhood where your company is located, they are in abject poverty. Life is becoming miserable for them. And you see this, for example, in the Niger Delta. I don't know if you have been there. You can't find good water, no clean water. Boiled water, you can't drink it. Now, acid rain make farming terrible. Now, roofing, for example. If you have a zinc roof in the Niger Delta near where these operations are happening, because of acid rain, they don't last 6 months. That is, of course, creating financial burden for the neighbors. And not to talk about the health challenge that it portends for the people who live in those environments. And this is why even the sustainability goal that the world is promoting also speak to this fact that when you are talking about sustainability, there are 3 key factors that are important. While you are emphasizing profit, you must also make sure that the planet is not destroyed, reasonable use of the planet, which of course the president spoke to in Onga yesterday, and then people, which is the most significant part of the component of the sustainability debate, inclusion. So when we're also talking inclusion, you must also ensure that you give us the requisite technical skill, even apart from the street light that you are providing for us, that you really empower the people who are the locals to benefit from the technology that draws these natural resources from our environment. I think we can get into that level of agreement with multinationals and corporations that do business with us as a nation.
Let me paint a picture of what we have here in Nigeria. It's generally agreed that Nigeria is blessed with natural resources. But we're talking about the economic aspect now. Interestingly, Nigeria has over 40 solid minerals. And if you look at every state, virtually every state is blessed with one resources or the other. But the challenge here comes the issue of exclusive lists. You know, exploring these solid minerals, you know, we have a provisions of the law that says it's on the exclusive list, which means it's on the prerogative of the federal government to determine who is going to explore and how it's going to be managed. Now, the essence of having this natural resources economics concept is the fair distribution of these resources. Would you say with what we have that we have a fair distribution of these resources? I mean, look at what is happening in Zamfara, you know, the crisis, you know, trailing the gold mine in Zamfara. With that example, will you say there's a fair distribution and administration of these resources looking at the issue of exclusive list when it comes to exploring these solid minerals?
Yeah, but I think there also need to be some measure of fairness, really, to speak to that issue. The Land Use Act that actually granted ownership of all lands to state governments in Nigeria, the Act of 1976, really has also messed up a lot of things. And of course, this also speaks to the issue that while the land belongs to the state, the mineral in the land belongs to the federal. Seems to be a contradiction in terms. And I think some of all these policies we have to review. Because we also see in other federations, like in the American Federation, that is not same in terms of who owns the resource. In short, as a matter of fact, I think you look at some of these states, the resource, if it's found in your land, actually belongs to you. And all you do is pay royalty to government. And of course, that speaks to some measure of equity. And I think we need a balance in terms of how these laws really operate. But I think, in my mind, I may be wrong, that those who make that laws in Nigeria were only looking at one direction. Because they've always seen the oil resource, and they were blinded to other natural resources which God had given to to us as a country. Now, when you look at our political development and evolution, you see that when we started using the Republican Constitution in 1963, what we actually have is that all regions had access to their resources. And that was before oil was discovered in Loibiri. So at that time, it was not a national asset. They were regional assets. And you see, this has been the advocacy from the Niger Delta. When cocoa was our mainstay, it belonged to the western region. When groundnut was our mainstay, it belonged to the northern region. When coal was our mainstay, it belonged to the eastern region. Why don't allow the oil to belong to us? Why make it a national asset? And this is, for me, really, the blindedness of people who actually thought those things out, because they were thinking that the only resource we had was oil on the ground. And they were not really paying attention to other blessings that God has given to us. Now that we know that there is so much underground and also equally distributed, there is no state in Nigeria that is at disadvantage. All that is required is the right ecosystem for the exploration of these resources, and they will have their things. And this is where the government was also, the president was speaking to the issues and activities of illegal companies that are doing mining, collaborating with locals who cannot see beyond their nose. And what they are doing is that they are taking these resources away almost for free. We should review those laws. I think the National Assembly should also consider this aspect, because it's important if we must develop. And of course, this also will enable the custodians, the immediate stakeholders of those natural resources to protect that wealth. You see, because those in the Niger Delta who are sabotaging the pipe, they don't see it as their own. They see it as other people coming to exploit their land. And so they are sabotaging the process because they don't feel part of it. And I think if we have policies that really make the indigenes and the local critical stakeholders, not just giving pythons to them in the name of creating agencies here and there, it will become very possible. I was doing a simple analysis. When NDDC was set up, the first 2 years of operation, 80% of the budget of NDDC was devoted to capital projects. 2 years after, it flipped. 80% is spent on overhead, while only 20% go to capital project, which really is not serving the need of the locals. Because now you just move from the 20%, now you have created the Ministry of Niger Delta, which is really adding no value, so to speak, except that it just empowers few individuals who work in those councils. But the amelioration of the degradation that is happening in the places where they are harvesting these natural resources really do not happen. And I think some of all this policy need to be reconsidered by the National Assembly, and the executive also must take it and understand that if we must grow and develop, we must be strategic in terms of how we think about what God has given to us in nature.
Okay, looking at the degradation and how to address that. Now, a while ago, you talked about respect for global agreements. Now, where the respect for global agreements, where companies do not do what is ethically and morally right, what happens? What should the government in that area or that country do, like in Nigeria? Because, like we've talked about, it is the federal government that oversees mining and exploration of minerals in the country. So where these agreements are not adhered to, where the companies do not do what is ethically and morally right as it concerns the environment, where they get the minerals from, what should the government do? What should be the follow-up action to it?
You see, this is where I've spoken so passionately about our value system as a people. Look at the celebrated PR&ID case. The civil servant who engineered that contract only benefited 100 million. And look at how much the nation has expended prosecuting that case alone. Not to talk about the risk of what we stand to lose if we eventually lose that case. This is the issues that we speak to from time to time, where people are not nationalistic, where you have a lot of citizens who are not patriotic, and they enter into agreements that do not favor their own country because of what they're going to benefit from those agreements. And this makes it very difficult for you to actually prosecute. I was speaking with one of my friends, an Indian, and he said, look, I don't think that Nigerians are lacking intellectuals to really scrutinize their agreements. He just believed that some people, they prioritize themselves over and above the nation. This is why you find that there's always a difficulty in following or pushing the legal part. And also forget that even some of our people, especially in the legal professions, who know how to use injunction and counter injunction to make cases to last forever, will not even make legal option viable. So this is the nightmare we find ourselves in terms of some of all this agreement. But I must tell you very clearly that some of this agreement, they are skewed against the nation. And we are looking for a patriotic nationals who stands on behalf of the government and put the nation first in terms of negotiating agreement. So if you sign out a contract, and of course the contract has no penalty clauses, the contract has no compensation clauses, and then of course you only look at, because you turn a blind eye because somebody has settled you from behind, then you can't prosecute such a case. So this is the issues, and I think where our nations needs to be more open-eyed when looking at international conventions and practices.
One of the main objectives of natural resources economics is to also ensure the availability of these resources for future generation. Now, looking at the way these resources are being managed in Nigeria, do you think these resources will be available for the future generation?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. And I also think that this is why in the recent years, the United Nations also have been emphasizing how do we live today and also ensure that the children will have life tomorrow and those who are yet to be born, in terms of the prudence in harvesting these natural resources. And that's why a lot of people are emphasizing the non-renewable sources of energy, for example. And people are advocating green, economy as we speak to. Yeah, but the challenge before us is that we are still so very hungry. And like Esau in the story I told you from Mesa Otabi's book, if I don't eat this rice pottage, I will die. And is the challenge that faces Africa. And so everybody speaks to the issue of poverty. So if you have poverty, then of course you have to exploit this. But we also know that green financing is very expensive. Take for example, if you look at the Neom City in Saudi Arabia, that project is estimated to cost about $500 billion to finance. And this is massive. Where will Africa get 500 billion to support renewable source? And this is just one city being built. So this is the issue. And this is why also I always advocate for homegrown solutions. How can we begin to really prioritize research and development so that our cerebral minds are given the leverage in our institutions to experiment with ideas so that they can create homegrown solutions to our problems.
All right, looking at conservation, it is not just the solid minerals that we need to look at conserving. Let's look at our forests, timber and everything. Day after day, we see constant felling of trees, and we see an increase in the level of deforestation. But there are need for this timber that are being extracted from the forest and all, but how do we ensure that as much as we have need for these resources, there is also a balance, and we are also conserving the resources that we have for future use?
I think it's a matter of policy for me, speaking, and the nation needs to be deliberate. I understand that in Israel, for example, for every single child that is born, a tree is planted. Every single child that is born. Now, in places like Australia, if you cut one tree, have a license to cut one tree, then there's a legal obligation on you to plant two. This is very important. These are deliberate policy to conserve, because we don't have forests anymore. Species are gone. And this is even the real threat to life. You see, because the synergy between the environment and human survival is very tight and strong. I was teaching on Sunday, and I asked my young people, the mandate we are given by God, if you're a Christian like me, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, is to rule over our environment, to multiply it, to replenish it. And I was asking, how do you replenish? So which means when God gave man that mandate to rule his environment, he also gave man the mandate to replenish it. So which means if you take one, you have to fill it back. Now, but we have failed in that direction. And I think we must have deliberate national policies to foster this. Elementary biology says to us that we get oxygen majorly from plants. Now, if the source of oxygen is gone, so which means human existence is threatened. And this is how we need to see the conservation of the environment, to ensure that the natural habitat which God created to sustain man is not completely destroyed, so that when we have life today, and our children and our children's children will also have life. I feel that the government needs to be very deliberate and strategic about this conservation.
Let's look at the issue of illegal mining of those natural resources. A good example is what is playing out in Zamfara. And if you look at different states, you see that playing out at different levels at different states. Conflicts here and there, insecurity here and there. What does this suggest to you about the management of these resources in Nigeria, and what can be done to ensure there's fairness and equity?
Yeah, the IIC will speak to national laws in terms of how to regulate some of all these practices. Yeah, but the challenge I have at the moment is to say that we're having non-state actors that are much more powerful than the state actor. This is really the problem that I see in our country. And so the security operatives are overwhelmed. They can really not arrest some of all these situations. This is the problem. Now, look at it, just looking at the way the nature had designed so many things. Again, on Sunday, I was speaking to the issue, because we're always looking at the solid rock. Water is also a natural resource, for example. And water has capacity to dry up. I remember in 2015, when the former president was speaking to the public secretary before appointing minister at that time. So he asked them to be giving, you know, some updates on their various ministry. And I remember in one particular engagement with the Ministry of Solid Mineral and the Ministry of Water Resources, the PS was making a presentation. And halfway that presentation, the president asked him to stop and said that this presentation seems not complete in my view. And he said there was a certain report which he saw while he was in Sandhurst training as a military officer that focused on Lake Chad, its drying up and its impact on the whole of northern Nigeria. That when he stumbled on that particular research, he brought it to the attention of the then head of state, Olusegun Obasanjo. Nigeria invested some money, I think he said about 55 million at that time, to further that research. And he said it was gazetted. And that report was somewhere that they had not spoken to it. So which also speaks to the fact that water dries. Because the Lake Chad Basin has dried up, what is the effect on us? Desertification. That up to about close to 40-50% of the landmass in the northeast has been taken over by desert. And you have this attendant effect of migration, which is creating pressure in the Mindo belt that we talk about, Herders Farmer crisis. So you see, if we don't look at our issue holistically, we will be seeing that we are not paying attention to things that can dry up, even including water. Look at it. Abuse and the use of boreholes in Nigeria, where people are looking for water. I was speaking to people in my close. We have about 8 houses in the close, and every single house had a borehole. And I was asking one of our landlords, but this is not fair. We could have one borehole in that street, and everybody have access to it. It's better than every house having a borehole. Because what you're doing is that you're actually crossing the earth. And I was saying on Sunday to some group of young boys, look at it. Morocco, earthquake. 2,000 people lost to earthquake. Now we say, oh, Nigeria was not prone to earthquake. And I said in the last 10 years, we have seen tremor in Abuja. And this is the activities of humans who are trying to find comfort, drilling the soil, cracking the earth crust upon which all of us are sitting, without realizing that one day these things can split open and all of us will have no life. I think that the government needs to be very deliberate in how people are exploiting the resources that nature has given to us, so that all of us can collectively have a life to live after we enjoy for a brief moment.
But talking about water, you know, they refer to water as life. Water
Yes.
is life. Water is needed for almost every activity of life. And what led to individuals owning boreholes was when the central water distribution channels were no longer functioning. People were not getting water in their homes, so individuals had to take it upon themselves to begin to drill boreholes. But in countries where you don't find water easily like that, they've come up with technologies that help them recycle water. And even researchers have talked about, and environmentalists have talked about how much of waste, how much we waste water in Nigeria. So what can we do to ensure that there is water available and we do not disturb nature in trying to get water? And we also reclaim maybe areas where there have been desertification. Is it possible to reclaim some of these areas?
Yeah, it's very possible. I think if, let me start from the last one. If Israel had been able to turn the desert into green place, I think it's possible. That can be done, and I think it has to be deliberate, and there should be massive investment in this effort. If we are reclaiming water, we should be able to reclaim the desert naturally. But you see, again speaks to policy of government. where we are able to actually enforce some major, what do I call it now, policy or laws to regulate practices. Now, in these areas that you're speaking to, you see what they're doing? They are recycling water. They are not looking for it underground. So, recycling technology is also available, and people can have it. But you see, there must be a deliberate law, for example, in Nigeria that forbids people from seeking borehole. Because we don't see it today, the impact today. But there's an impact that will affect all of us tomorrow and collectively. So this is the issues that we speak to. It's not just borehole. There are a whole lot of things that we are not doing well here. And this is also speaking to the issues. People who are urban planners, city planners, need to also take into consideration. Now, these wastewater are able to be recycled because you have a central sewage system where you can collect all these things. And I think that as building new cities, we must deliberately invest in this basic infrastructure. That also even brings me to the questions, apart talking about water, talking about rock, talking about this underground. Even the use of our land space, which is also a natural resource to us. We have been sitting on a land size of about 923,000 square kilometers since Nigeria was born. That land mass is not going to increase. But our population is increasing annually by about 2.5%. And if you factor that 2.5%, we are saying by 2030, we will be reaching about 300 or 350 million people. And by 2050, Nigeria will be about 450 million people, still sitting on the same land size. Now, what are our planners doing? We are still issuing C of O to development companies to be developing horizontally without thinking about populations that are coming in the future. Whereas cities like China with bigger landmass are growing and developing vertically. What we do is that you give one person a 60 by 120 square kilometer, he build one small space. You give another one person 60 by, look, at the end of the day, you will not have a place to build. And I think those who are planning our nation must also be looking at this resource of land, which is the most important factor in production, to see that we are growing vertically. That rather than allow one person to own one plot of land, we can have two together and have over 300, 400 people live on that same, and then the building is going up. I think we need to think about this thing in terms of preserving what God has given to us in nature.